Hello guys, this is Low Tech Gaming here. So I want to have a little discussion about my thoughts on the ordinance changes essentially in regards to how carriers work nowadays. So when the game came out, the biggest change between Battlefleet Gothic 1 and 2 in terms of carrier use was the fact that you could launch multiple squadrons and you could also send them basically wherever you wanted as well. And it gave a lot of freedom to the carrier gameplay or so. And as of the last patch, while the movement is still the same, you are now limited in the sense that you can only have one squadron out at any given time. Meaning that if you launch a fighter squadron out to do some recon, you cannot use any other squadrons aboard that same ship until that squadron returns or is destroyed. What is it? I have very, very high mixed feelings about this. Mostly, well, if any of you guys have been watching my campaign, essentially, I built my entire Tyranid fleet around basically, shoving ordnance down the AI's throat until they would just cease to exist. With the latest patch, it has made it so I had to change my entire meta at the last stages of the campaign, which kind of sucks. So for the campaign, it's one thing if you developed your entire fleet around using carriers, basically using ordnance. But in terms of multiplayer, while it depends on your point of view. I have 2 points of view on this. First is like a lore point of view, also kind of like a realism point of view, where I'm just like, okay, so I have 1,000 ships, 1,000 fighters on my carrier. I have launched 100 fighters out. The CO tells me that the CAG Union refuses to send out any more fighters. Or bombers, for that matter. They've worked with the bomber and the boarding assault boat union as well. And they are refusing to send any other ships into the void until that fighter squadron is destroyed, or whether or not it returns or not, essentially. It just, on that side, it doesn't make sense, or so, the failure to utilize all your air groups, essentially, at the same time. Like, for example, the reason why carriers were so effective was because they could launch all their aircraft, or so the ones that didn't need to be maintenance or that didn't have to be on patrol. Essentially, they could categorize their air groups and launch them accordingly, and they could just swarm the enemy with bombers, basically. Bombers and fighters. I know why the change was made. The change was made because of the fact that these fleets were so powerful that it made conventional fighting between, two ships almost obsolete. Kind of the same as how real-life carriers did that to, naval warfare. Even up to this point, essentially. So it had some type of realistic precedent there. That smaller void ships that could be considered expendable could be sent out there to do massive amounts of damage while reducing the amount of damage done to your fleet. And there's enough seems to be because to be frank, it is enough. I mean, they have decreased the point costs for carriers across the board for what I can tell, essentially. Even the custodian has gone down by at least almost 30 to 40 points, essentially. So it's not like they kept the carriers at the same price level. But I feel like they didn't add enough to make it. I mean, okay, so let me backpedal just a little bit because I like to digress too much. So, narrative and lore point of view doesn't make any sense. it's kind of, it's iffy in my opinion. So why? Because I'm just wondering why my battleship or my carrier won't launch any more craft now, because I've gotten that mindset in my head that as long as I can just keep the squadrons going. So now I can't. From a gameplay point of view, it does make it so the conventional ships are in fact a little more useful. Like it's reduced the effectiveness of carriers or so, and makes them more of a supporting unit for the main ships instead of the actual attacking craft, essentially. Like the ordnance on ordnance meta was quite cancerous, especially if you've seen any of my cancer Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 multiplayer videos where I just sat in a corner, launched boarding craft against, any foe, with the exception of maybe the Tyranids, and they would just be overwhelmed with fighters, and then overwhelmed with, boarding pods that would just kill all the crew members on board those ships, essentially. Even with the new meta, it would still happen. So even with the new boarding mechanic, it would still happen. It's just that they would delay the inevitable, or just make themselves vulnerable trying to deal with my boarders. You can't do that now. I mean, you technically can. If your fighters get wiped out, you can just scramble out boarders, but now if you want to do the same thing, you have to do so with less reinforcements. You have to have half of your fleet launch fighters, and then the other half launch boarders, essentially. You have to mix it up a little bit now. And from from what I've told, or not what I've been told, what I've actually played, because I actually went after I played the campaign for so many hours, I went to the multiplayer and wanted to figure out how this affected the meta, essentially. And the meta is now where the actual ships are more valuable, so the direct action ships are more valuable than the carriers. The carriers are merely a way to do more damage to ships that don't have carriers, or as a way to prevent ordnance from other carriers or so. Like, my current meta fleet for Chaos consists of just all cruisers with a single Styx battle cruiser carrier, just because there is still a need for carriers out there to repel other carriers, but it's just they're not as offensively prone as they used to be, essentially. I would even go as far as to say that they're almost akin to... They're a little bit on the same levels as Battlefleet Gothic Armada 1 carriers, in the sense that they should not be you should not be launching long-range attacks. If anything, you should be reacting to other carriers or using them in close quarters, just because you can actually increase your DPS that way, and make it so the enemy doesn't have as much time to react to your attacks. As launching long-range strikes is now impractical, as the enemy can see them coming from a mile away, and you can't send any other squadrons to back them up, as you have to wait for the squadron to either die or come back. They added the ability to recall the squadron you sent out. I don't know why you would do that in a multiplayer match, unless you made a really bad call and you were literally sending your fighters out to die, I guess. Or if you sent one to scout out an area, then you'd probably want to recall that fighter squadron. But I think what they need to do now... So I guess I do need to solidify my opinion on this. Lore-wise, it's just it doesn't make sense. Your carriers should be able to launch as many fighters as they can, as quickly as they possibly can. That's the role of carriers in warfare. But in terms of gameplay, it does make it so it's less ordnance spamming, essentially. As, the Orcs, Chaos, the Tau, the Tyranids, and basically anyone who could spam out carriers could do massive amounts of damage to you. So it has reduced this by quite a bit. Lore-wise, iffy about it, but gameplay-wise, it probably helped out a lot of players who are frustrated with getting swarmed by carriers. So I'll give the game that. But I feel like they need to go and now add more depth to the actual carriers now, because since they've limited the amount of ordnance, the amount of squadrons you can actually put out. I think they should now go and add more power to the individual squadrons if they're going to do this. I feel like they should. You don't need to increase its power. I think the one thing I want now is the ability to actually command squadrons, essentially. Tell them to go to certain locations, scout out certain locations, give them actual orders. Be able to tell bombers to switch targets, to move around, to act as scouts, or to even, retreat to another point if enemy fighters are approaching them, essentially. Instead of just being a straight-on a straight-on occurrence where you have to either send them to a ship or send them to a target area, and they just hover around that target or that ship until the ship dies, or they run out of fuel and have to go back to the carrier, or wait until you recall them. You should be able to actually give them more commands, so you can actually have it where you send out your interceptors in front of your ship to actually intercept enemy fighters, bombers, and ordnance coming your way, as well as being able to move to counter other threats that may come out. So like maybe you want to send your fighters to go and intercept enemy fighters, you keep them in the area, you tell them to engage another fighter squadron that comes in, and then you send them after like the enemy carrier to like spawn camp whatever bombers he might want to send out or so. Something along those lines, or something that increases the usability, because if you're going to only give carriers a single squadron to use, I feel like that single squadron should have more usability behind it now, because now since you can't spam them out as frequently, I think they should have more power behind them, or more mobility and control behind them, essentially. I could understand how if you could spam out all the squadrons and you could control when they get there, someone could simply mass a giant wave of bombers and just have them all go after one ship simultaneously, melting it from the face of the void. But with that not the case, I feel like there should be, more control over where your ordnance graph goes. But this is just my opinion, essentially. So gameplay-wise, it's okay. Lore-wise, it's basically, it doesn't make any sense at all, really. But gameplay-wise, it's probably doing more good than harm, essentially. So props to the developers on that end. I just wish they would have done it after I finished the 200 campaign, so I could have still used my overpowered carrier armadas, essentially. But what can you do, essentially? Anyway, tell me what your thoughts are in the comment section below, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you guys next time.